Hello everybody, welcome back to the Overwater player-to-player interview series. Today we are going to sit down with Phil Donnelly. Phil is a London-based bass player who plays a lot on the West End scene there and also with artists like Damian Lewis and Lainey Wilson. In the interview we're going to be talking about ways Phil approaches learning lots of music in short spaces of time, how he approaches doubling, which is playing electric bass and double bass to a very high standard, and also how his classical upbringing has helped him work as an electric bass player today. Enjoy! Tell us how you found your way into the industry, what kind of gigs were you doing back then, and how did you then get a foothold from being someone that played bass, someone that practiced bass, to someone that played bass for a living?
I'm still not good at anything else. There was never a choice, you know. And from the youngest age, it was all I ever wanted to do. It was all I ever, showed any interest in whatsoever. So there wasn't ever a sort of thought about my options. It was like, that's what he's going to do. That's what I'm going to do. So did every music thing in school, played every instrument going, played lots of guitar, and I still play quite a lot of guitar actually. And then went to Guildhall and studied classical double bass, which was an interesting journey. But the whole time I was playing electric bass, playing guitar, playing in bands, everything else, doing shows, doing all that sort of thing. So I always knew that, although I have done a bit of that since, I wasn't going to be one of those people who just sat in an orchestra and played in orchestras all day. My mind isn't that way. Whenever I did orchestras as a kid, the feedback from the staff would be like, oh yeah, he's obviously into it, but he just cannot concentrate on his own part. Like I was so interested in everyone else and the sort of thing of just playing the same part with everyone all the time, that just didn't appeal to me. When I could on, the next night on an after school club, be in jazz band and essentially play whatever I wanted.
Did that discipline of studying classical upright, does it cross over into your electric playing?
Yeah, I mean, things that are just invaluable. Firstly, understanding that world. If I'm playing with an orchestra on electric bass, which does happen, every now and then, I'm not overly intimidated by that world and those people. I'm not saying I should be, or I'm not saying that as a brag. Like, I know the way that world works, and quite often I'll do things where there'll be a rhythm section with an orchestra, and people will be petrified of the conductor, or they haven't had those years of experience. And I didn't realise it until those points, being like, we've done this loads, haven't we? It's made me very relaxed in those environments, and knowing what they want to see, knowing how that world works, knowing how to read a conductor, when the downbeat is there, all that sort of thing.
They can be a little bit wavy.
Yeah. Knowing when to sort of take the reins maybe or whatever. So all that's been so super useful. And that world also on occasion flows into like the show playing, which I've done a bit of the last few years, and being able to follow a conductor really wins them over quite quickly. Having a rhythm section player who can do all the drum stuff, and when they leave you to it, that's great. But on the occasional sort of dictated bit, yeah, it's been a really useful skill, that on the electric, to have that in your sort of arsenal.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's something that I've found when I've done stuff in town, on the West End or other shows. You get very comfortable and very used to playing with click all the time. But then you can feel very exposed. If you have to come in really strong on a downbeat at the start of something, and you're just looking often in a pit in the West End or something, just on a little monitor.
Yeah.
You're just waiting for a guy to do this to you. Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a different experience. I guess with the arco playing, that's often a thing on West End shows or Broadway shows where you're being asked to play electric bass, fretless bass, double bass, and there's a lot of bowed parts on the double bass in a lot of those shows.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say that it was this sort of clever 16-year-old going like, oh, well, I'll keep playing electric bass in bands, but if I get my classical stuff together, then I'll be super like employable, which I'm not sure I really am. But as a doubler and all this, and it really wasn't, I'd always had classical lessons. I'd had a great classical teacher at home, Ali Yates. They were the sort of lessons I had, and any sort of jazz or rock things were generally more group experiences or like just bands, playing with friends. So I didn't really have the concept to study that like that. And I often think maybe I should have, and I often think maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I don't know if I'm really jazz enough to be on a jazz course. I think I'd done too much of that stuff to go and study it somewhere like BIM. I think those places are so good, but I think I'd sort of just inadvertently ticked a lot of those boxes. So it just felt the right thing to do. There were times when I was pretty bored of playing excerpt. But yeah.
I had a few years when I was getting calls to do those kind of classical crossover things and West End things where I was being asked to do quite a lot of pretend classical double bass was kind of how I felt about it. I did the Steve Hackett Genesis Revisited orchestra thing, Il Divo and a few other things like that. Yeah, I kind of got into just kind of dip my toes into that world in terms of like doing some excerpts and obviously doing like the Samandal and the Rabath stuff. And it's a lot of work, man. It's quite hard to come into it when you're kind of used to being competent and confident at something. And it feels very much with the bow in those years like I was going back to kind of right back to the beginning with it. I'm quite envious of someone that feels fairly natural with it, because it's still something now that if I get asked to do, I know I want to practice that quite a lot beforehand just to make sure I'm getting a nice sound.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say that I don't have that anymore, but I very much do. That realisation on sort of week one of music college, sort of realising that, oh, you'll never master this. You know, one will never sort of master this. I'd never come to terms with that concept. Oh, so I won't like complete bowing. It's not like, okay, that's your bowing done. Like, let's go on to the next thing, you know.
How do you stay sharp if you're playing upright and electric? How do you make sure that you're ready to go on both? I know, again, from my experience, I've gone through a phase. I've just done quite a lot of touring in the last year, playing all electric. So if I had a double bass gig coming up now, I would have to really, really practice because I have 0 calluses left. Have you got any tips on how people can stay on top of those things?
It's a really hard one, isn't it? I think that way round is much harder, going from lots of electric to some upright. I think if you're upright heavy, then get into electric. For me, on the electric, I have enough sort of tricks up my sleeve to get by. And I might think, oh, God, I'm nowhere on this. But you do sort of know that if you put your finger there, it will play a G. No. And even if you're there or there, it still will play a G. So I think the electric gets to a certain level and it's sort of, you'd like to think it takes care of itself. And the other thing I try and do with electric, if I'm playing more upright, is just be listening loads. So if I'm not in an opportunity, like I'm away, you know, like you mentioned, you're on tour a lot, be sort of still doing the study, but over ears, you know. And I think so much of it's that now, isn't it? Like it gets to, in my head, it sort of gets to a level, unless you want to be playing, like, you want to be really like smashing out like some Anthony Jackson stuff or some Jacko stuff, or whatever. It gets to a level where sort of I think everyone can kind of play. You can make a nice sound, you can get around the instrument enough. Chances are most gigs you're not going to have anything that technically like hairy. So I'm making sure that like the muscles, you know, the sort of mental muscles like time and groove and all those things are still being exercised, even if it's just, you know, being like, right, today I'm going to just listen to loads of Verdine White or listen to loads of, you know, whoever it is, doesn't really matter, you know, whatever the thing people are working on. But the upright is a harder one. I think without that time, it is hard to keep it going. I think the secret is, and it feels so counterintuitive when you're doing it, and the thing that I've found is the best thing for like having to quickly get it back together to get, you know, for a gig the next day, is just slow practice, metronome at 40, scales, crotchet scales. It feels agonizing.
Yeah, but that's where you really get into the detail. If you practice something slowly at 40 BPM or whatever, when you speed it up to 80, 90, it's like you can see the matrix all of a sudden.
Totally.
Because your brain's been stretched by doing the slow practice, and now playing at normal tempos feels much more natural. You're much more able to play within the pocket.
Totally. And I think for me the big thing is actually like muscle memory where all the notes actually are, and making a sound. So yeah, if you're doing slow practice and you're listening, my friend Abby Bowen was talking about practice she's been doing. She's an amazing viola player, and she does practice with drones, which I'd never done before. And that's incredible. Just getting on YouTube and typing in like organ drone E, then playing a scale, like, and you can then you just got you know, the best tuner, your ears, you know, you can just tune every note, and it's
Yeah, I still have a file on my laptop with a bunch of drones that, you know, Darren McCarthy.
Yeah, great bass player.
Yeah, so Darren put me onto that when I first started down my double bass journey.
Oh, nice.
That was a good tip of Darren's to get into drones, and something I definitely still practice with now. You were saying to me before we jumped on the call that you've been working quite a lot in the kind of Nashville and also the UK country scene. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because that's not something that I'm particularly au fait with. How did you get involved in that kind of working in country music?
Yeah, it was a funny one. It all happened probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. And Chris Bryce, who's a drummer who is from the UK and now lives out in Nashville, he got a call about a gig with these two, with a Nashville duo called American Young, which is John Stone and Christy Osmondson, doing a gig in Zurich, like a festival in Zurich, and they wanted a European rhythm section, which was just too expensive to fly over. And we did that thing of, you know, learning up all the tunes together, sitting in here and shedding them like mad, and, you know, no rehearsal, no run through, just, you know, do the gig. Which on gigs when I've done it with a lot more kind of production and clicks, and it sort of feels weirdly a bit safer if you have a sort of, you know, talk back or even just, you know, cues on a track and all that. But it was a real jam band. And it was funny, I went in, when Chris told me about the gig, I was really excited about it. I wasn't particularly nervous about it. I sort of learnt up the tunes, got a cool pedal board together, you know, didn't think much of it. There was nothing, they're great songs. They've written some amazing songs, but they're just songs. There's nothing, you know, there's no fusion. There's no, you know, I thought, oh yes, it'll be fine, you know. And funny, got to the night before the gig, we met the guys who were great, and I had absolute fear of just like, what am I doing? I don't know it at all, you know. It was one of the first times I'd done that plenty in Depping when you've got the pad and all that, but sort of people, I think as well, the fact they're from America, I felt quite a lot of pressure. I'd never really done that thing before. But anyway, we got away with it, and we all really hit it off, the four of us, and did loads more dates with them. And from there, it just sort of snowballed. I've got to do some nice things. Played some nice shows with Lainey Wilson a few years ago, who's just an absolute mega star now. And yeah, it's been a really nice hookup actually. I'm trying to spend a bit more time out over there and sort out the visa and do all that sort of thing. But it's an amazing place. It's, you know, just music literally everywhere. You know, it's just incredible.
I suppose that's you saying you felt quite pressured before the first show. Does that come from you? Obviously, you want to sound authentic in a music that is, you know, a very much an American art form, something you wouldn't necessarily have grown up with. But were you listening to that kind of music a lot? How did you go about getting inside that kind of sound and sounding authentic when you played it?
Yeah, it was funny. I didn't get too cut up about that, and the hearing they're quite a sort of contemporary sounding group, so it was all I think I did play some upright on a tune or two, but it's all electric. It's quite bandy, and to me, I don't really. I mean, the fact that there might be like some of those sonics in there, like banjo, steel guitar, maybe slightly more acoustics or whatever, that's the only thing that makes it country music to me. But it's just like, they're just songs, you know. And maybe there's other artists, but generally most of this country music, I think the lyric has a lot to do with it and where that's from and what that's about. But a lot of this music, to me, it's just music, you know. And like, I approach some of those tunes like rock tunes. Some of them are kind of heavy, you know, it was P bass with a pick. Some of them are kind of funky, you know. So I was keen to get the sounds right for the gig. The thing that I got in my head about was that they're these sort of two super hit writers from Nashville who've worked with, you know, like, I mean, on their sessions in the past, they've had Victor Wooten, O'Teal Burbridge, you know, Vinnie Colaiuta on drum. Like, they've had like the real who's who. And I was just like, I just had that thing of like, do I really know this well enough? And they will know. You know, we've all done things with people who you think, oh, I sort of got away with that. And I'm not sure I quite remembered that bridge in that chorus, you know, in that tune, you know. But, you know, someone shouted a chord at me and it was all good and the singer never knew. But once I sort of realised how proper they were and how heavy they were as artists, obviously their music was great, but actually just as people and how invested to that other side of it they were, you know, that's when I was a bit like, yeah, do I really know this, you know? Found myself sort of going to bed that night before the gig, frantically like blast listening everything, you know, as if that would make any difference whatsoever. You know?
Yeah, but it's you can't help but do it. I mean, I still do the same thing. I will listen to the music, you know, obviously practice it like hell. But then when I'm driving to the first rehearsal, I'll have it on in the car and all those things just to like. And I'm going through it in my head, like, do I know exactly what's coming up in 4 bars time, all the rest of it? And even though you know it doesn't really make a damn bit of difference by the time you get there, but it feels like I've got half an hour here. I should be using that half an hour to make sure I'm there.
And similarly, that was another muscle that, you know, like I mentioned earlier, that I hadn't been using like in a long time, really. You know, any sessions at that time I was doing were always, here's the sheet music, go for it. Or here's the sheet music, but do your thing a bit. And then any jazz gigs were always sort of the standard gigs. So I always had an iPad or a chart, big band chart. And then if it wasn't that, I was doing West End shows. So realizing that was like a muscle that as a kid I'd probably used so much and could learn tunes much quicker. It's been a good thing to work on, actually. And now I feel, you know, I would be able to do half as much work to get to that place where I was sort of for those gigs, you know.
Yeah, I shared a clip of a chat I had with Sandy Beals talking about the kind of way he goes about memorising when he's got a lot of material he needs to learn. Have you got any thoughts on that? Have you got any particular tips that you could give people or kind of methods you use if you need to learn 12 songs in the next 2 days? How are you going to go about it?
Yeah, I do. I did a thing a few years ago. It was actually in lockdown, and it was all legit. It was a country festival in Liechtenstein, and we were playing with. It was me, Luke Barrett, and Luke Thomas, who I played with loads, who are both sort of UK country session guys and both brilliant. And we played for William Michael Morgan from Nashville. We played with Kezia Gill. I think Jade Helliwell did some songs and Gary Quinn did some songs. So we had 60 tunes to learn in Liechtenstein. And it was in COVID, and we had to do all the documents to make sure it was all legit and everything. And, you know, they took that really seriously. But it meant that I had nothing else on. You know, the months coming up, you know, weeks, months coming up before that. So I set myself the challenge. I mean, I must have been bored. I mean, what a saddo. As I say this story, I sort of hate myself, but I set myself the challenge to see if I could do the whole run without any music, without any cheat sheets, without anything. Yeah, like 63, 64 tunes. And the way I did it, I had 2 Spotify playlists, learnt and to learn, and would just try and like work through like maybe like 5 or 6 a day. Maybe it was more than that, but like a bunch of tunes a day. And I was spending all day on it, and I had all day to spend on it because where we were, you know, nowadays that would be much more tricky for everyone to do because, you know, we're allowed out of the house. I literally wasn't allowed out, you know. So yeah, we did, I think I did like play tune number 1 like 3 times, play tune number 2 3 times, and then go back to number 1, play it once, play tune number 3 3 times, back to number 2, play it once, back to number 1, play it once, and sort of did this like a bunch, and then it's always just dropping back in to the original ones. And that seemed to work quite well. I mean, maybe the numbers were more than that overall, and, you know, but it did sort of bed them in, you know. And I mean, Malcolm Edmonstone, who taught me a little bit at Guildhall, had a great thing of like, if you play something 5 times, you start to, I mean, maybe this is more of a jazz thing, or I don't know, but like I can't remember how he worded it, but you sort of interpret the way that if you're trying to like be like, oh, I'm going to sound like this or learn this song, you start to interpret that whole thing. You start to settle with it musically, groove with it. So it's a really good way of internalizing more than the notes, more than remembering like, don't forget the second chorus starts with the 4 chord or whatever. So yeah, that was my thing. I was like, I'm just going to and having that routine of just always dipping back in sort of somehow keeps it in your memory. I'm sure there's people out there who studied, long-term, short-term memory far more than I, and say it's such a waste of time the way I did it, but it seemed to just about work.
No, it's nice, and just to have some kind of method, even if it's the most efficient one or not. I think as long as you have a plan, you work your way down that list, then you're going to get there with it. And I suppose in a list of 64 odd tunes, you'll also rapidly work out some of them are the same 4 chords going all the way around, and
all of them
other stuff like that. Yeah. No wonder it was so easy. So you can kind of immediately put a bunch of them into the other column. Okay, I know what that is now, and then you know which ones are going to warrant spending more time on.
Yeah, weirdly, the hardest ones were the blueses, like the old sort of country blueses, because when you play them live, we didn't have like, a lot of them have so much production. Like there were a lot of covers with some Keith Whitley covers and stuff. And, there are a lot of covers in there which have so much production and like strings and all this. We didn't have all that, obviously, And the way we did it was cool. But a lot of those cues you don't realize, like, oh, there's a string line that comes in just on that second verse that means that it's this now, or disappear. That was the thing that slightly was like, ooh, you can't be. And similarly, we didn't have I don't think we had any rehearsal time, but you can't be led by you don't realize, well, I don't realize I'm doing it often, but I'll be led by the cues on the track being that specific drum fill means it's this thing here. But the blues are the ones that like, there's so many where like there's an extra bar before the turnaround and all these things. And when you're playing a blues, sort of, or you're on set 3 with artist 3 of the day, you're like, which one's this? They were the only ones that really would, I would look over to Luke Thomas, sort of. Yeah.
We can see you've got a lot of different instruments behind you, a lot of different pedals. Do you do a lot of work from your studio? And what kind of work are you doing? How is that coming in? And what kind of projects are you working on from there?
Yeah, the studio's been a real asset, actually. It was never really meant to be this sort of. It was just meant to be a place where I could just dump all my stuff and make noise and whatever. And the last few years, it's really been great. Loads of remote sessions the last few years, and actually quite a few in lockdown. And granted, they weren't. I was very lucky to have them. I don't want anyone thinking that I was sort of doing sessions every day for thousands and thousands of pounds. That was not the case at all. But that was a great opportunity to really try and like work on making sure your engineering's good, you're quick with Logic, and being able to do a recording and spend all day setting up how you're going to do it, and try every mic on a bass cab, and try every DI, and what happens if you plug it into here first and out to there, and all those things. And it's been great to do that. I've been producing quite a lot in here as well. Recently had Kezia Gill and Jade Helliwell they're working on something together, which I produced, and we had amazing strings in here. We had a string quartet recording in here as well for that project, which was great. So it's nice when it sort of, has many angles. We've had crazy days. We did the Pippa Cleary musical, My Sons Are Queer. We recorded the album here, and also it was a lot of the music that they used for the show. It was a one-person show where Rob Madge was the pretty sure it's Rob Madge, might fact check that, was the star, and it was there was no way you could have a band in that venue in that way, so they recorded all that here. And in one day we had to do it in a funny order for everyone's timetables. So we recorded upright bass, which I played, cello and clarinet, followed by vocal, the actual vocal for the record, which Rob was Rob did in such amazing time. It was incredible. And it just sounded like every take was just like, that's perfect, you know. So I was worried that was going to take all day. Then I think after that, we had something else. Oh yeah, guitars, which I also did. And then we did bass and drums, like electric bass and drums together. All in one day in the studio. I'm pretty sure we did 9 till 9. And I don't think I sat down once, but it's been great to make the space work like that, you know.
You talk about being quick on Logic. That's definitely a day where like you want to be quick. You want to know all your shortcuts and be flying around it pretty easily. How do you, when you're recording in the studio there, obviously kind of instruments tend to be horses for courses, right? You've talked about, you know, if there's kind of a rocky thing, it might be a P bass with a pick. I can see your Overwater behind you there. What kind of situations are you going to use an active 5-string like that on?
This is an interesting one, and not to get too bass nerdy.
Oh, come on, let's do it. It's a bass podcast.
Yeah, come on. This is our safe space.
Yeah.
Let me get this strap off so I can lift it out. This is the bass I've used. I've got two, and this is the one I've used. This is the one I designed. Well, I didn't design it. Trevor Barry designed it. I sat with him once. He played it. And I just thought, I'm absolutely having one of those. And I was so adventurous. I got the same colour. And Trev's such a monster. I sat with him on a Strictly rehearsal once. And like the sound was just so perfect. It was huge, but then like it was just the right sound for everything. And he just explained that. So it's a PJ. And he was like, well, I can sort of do everything with it. And, you know, I've got a P bass and I can do this, and showed all the times different things he does. And I was quite young at the time and he was really good to me. But yeah, this is great, this bass, because depending what you do to it after, it doesn't need to be overhyped. Now I love like an overhyped, you know, big fat active jazz, you know, I love that whole thing, of course. But the beauty of this bass, I mean, it has got, it's got a active buffer. That's all. There's no EQ or anything. It's just bringing the level up. You know, it does sound like a P bass when you put it all the way to the back. They don't ever sound exactly like jazz is, but they do that thing. It's fine. And then of course you've got the bridge if you need it just a bit more pokey. And this has been like the ultimate. There's loads of sessions I've done where I'll bring loads of basses. And then sometimes they don't want the whole thing of like, let's try sound. Sometimes people are like, what else have you got? You know, let's try all the sounds. But there'll be loads of sessions where I will always bring this and I'll just use this all day. It's all thanks to Trevor, really. He sort of showed me the way with this, and it just made sense. I was like, that's the thing. And it does sound like an old P bass if you want it. It does everything. Yeah. Yeah. Really
enjoyed that chat. I'll put a link to it on the video for people watching. We did an interview with Trevor Barry talking about he's got quite a few Overwaters, and he's just had a new Progress made that has all the Roland synth stuff built into it, so he can control synth sounds from his bass, which is very cool, and you can hear it on Strictly, like you said. The West End in particular, or Broadway if you're in America, can feel like quite a closed shop. I mean, obviously there is no magic key that gets you in there, but how did you go about meeting the right people and acquiring the right skills so that you could work in that environment?
Skills-wise, I was super lucky. A mutual friend of both of us, I think, Simona Budd, used to teach me at Junior Trinity. She was my musicianship teacher, which I haven't mentioned part of that. I mean, that was pre-Guildhall. That was in secondary school. I mean, and I think I was there for a long time, and I can actually trace back most of my sort of usable skills that I use at work to that place. You know, the source of that is always there. You know, that was an amazing time. She taught me, and she used to run, she used to MD, I hate the term, an Amdram in Finchley, which is where I'm from. But I mean, it was just like, honestly, still like, it felt just as big as a lot of nice West End things I've done to this day. They took it so seriously. They had a proper sound team, proper band, proper MD. Like, they'd get the real sets when they could, like the real lighting rigs. It was incredible. And she so generously like took a punt on me to play bass in, I think the first show I did with her was Fame. I think I don't know if you like sort of one of those sort of variety show things with her, and then one of their big shows was Fame. So sitting in the pit, and it was a bunch of professional musicians. Like it's like people who worked in the West End, people who played in orchestras, people who it was like when I was this sort of kid, you soon sort of learn. I think I sort of realised that. Whereas I enjoyed that way, I enjoyed that world. Similarly, as we talked about that thing of. It was meeting of all the worlds I was into. I was really interested in playing with bands and rhythm sections and playing electric bass. And I still had that thing of like working with a conductor and following and listening and all that sort of thing. So it sort of ticked all those boxes and I got really into it. She used to use me for loads of stuff, which was great. And then the head of music at my school, she was friends with a drummer called Ryan Martin. He's now like producing big shows and stuff. He's one of those guys. I think he sort of got bored of the West End by the age of 21 because he's just done it all. He was such a phenomenal drummer, and he kindly organised for me to sit in via Becky Byrne, my old teacher, at Wicked with when Don Richardson was on it, and Don really took me under his wing. And I was at school still. I wasn't at Guildhall yet, and. We had a good laugh, and he gave me some great advice that time, and Don later on gave me my first ever West End dep on Viva. Yeah, and it already had its notice, so I think it was a good move for him because he could sort of be like, if this guy just cannot play the bass, it's not great, but the show is closing, so there's a bit of like, yeah. But what that did for me, and I'd like to think he knew this, or he knows this, but I don't know if he does or not. What it did for me is that it meant that I could then, once I did it, and it went well, thankfully, didn't leave my room for like a month shedding it, but I chat to other people like Phil Mulford. I said, "Oh yeah, I've been depping on Viva," and Mulford was like, "Oh, then you can come and dep for me." It's like that. Someone called it the magic circle. You got to get a gig to do a gig. It's hard. I still see, I've got friends who are amazing musicians and players, far better than I am, or even was back then, who are trying to get into this world, to that world specifically, and it's so hard. There's not that much work really. There's a sort of core group of players, and they're all so good, and So I was super lucky. I just sat in with people, and I was interested in it. I think they liked the fact I genuinely had no hustle. Like, I went to sit in with Don. I mean, in that time I was in school, so there was obviously no way that I would have been doing a show, whatever. But even when I sat in with people later on, like when I was at Guildhall, which is when I started depping, when I was in college, I didn't ever think that people would get me in on stuff. I just was going to I was in that, I was at Guildhall, I was in that time of like learning and experiencing, and, I didn't for 1 second think that someone would be like, oh, okay, come and do the show next week, come do the show next month, whatever. And I think people really responded to that because, and I'm sure you've had it in what you've been doing, 'cause you've been doing some, huge things the last few years, but those people in those positions, those chair holders, they get inundated with people who are dying to get into that world. And as innocently and as lovely and as enthusiastic as it is, quite often it can come across as really pushy. I all know friends of mine who've been like, yeah, I was advised to send my CV off to the stage door and sort of expect to reply and all these things. It's like, oh, they mean so well, and like, how would they know that's not the right thing to do, And
yeah, I distinctly remember being in the pit at the Dominion doing Bad Out of Hell, and there was one of those letters that had made its way to the MD, and needless to say, it got laughed down in front of the whole band. Like,
obviously,
it doesn't work.
No, and it's hard because those people are just keen to, a lot of them are just keen to do it, but they don't know the system. And I think the fact that I was willing to come and watch things, sit in, I would never ask to see the pad, I'd never ask for recording, I'd never say, if you needed, I just didn't think they'd ever want me to. Why would they need to, And I think that inadvertently people really warmed to that because it meant that they had an option to, or they just had that thing of like, this person isn't going to be like getting after your gig and trying to, they get very defensive,
Yeah, absolutely. Networking is kind of the worst thing you can do, but at the same time, people have to know who you are. So you have to be, you have to be present, but you can't be pushy with it.
I mean, it's so hard. And I say this like, oh, I just fell on my feet and all this. I've definitely got situations wrong and roundabout ways, not exactly this, but being the guy who sent the CV and, not quite that, but, So although, I say, oh yeah, I fell into place. There's definitely been times when people have been, I'm sure have thought, go away.
Well, it's hard because when you're not in those circles, you need to find a way in. But I think it needs to happen in a more organic way. And
similarly, there's been times where I definitely think I've been too passive in the way I've approached things. And like, people I've hung out with and done all those things and done that whole thing of like, never hustling. And then you see like bands or you think like, oh, they've asked that person to do it, which I'd love to say that I'm at the stage where I don't care. And I care less, but I still care. And you think, oh, maybe I should have hustled more. And you think that person hustled them for years. They were really hustling, really annoying. And now they've got the gig, And maybe they weren't so annoying. Maybe they did it the right way,
Maybe so they just ground them down over all those years.
Yeah.
So maybe finally then, maybe this will be a bit of a collection of some of the stuff we've talked about. If you were starting out again and you were just getting to Guildhall, what advice would you give yourself? How would you do things differently if you were going to do them differently? Or what situations would you double down on to help your progression?
Great question. Yes, I think I would try and tell myself to not focus on what everyone else is doing, even worrying about like what the other bass players in my year got in their exams. And now I laugh at it because I'm like, well, the other bass players in my year, not saying that most of them, all of them, I'm sure were much better bass players than me. But, I remember there was one guy I was like, oh, God, he did so much better than me in this exam. I can't believe it. I thought I was playing really well. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter because you're not the same person. He's a phenomenally good orchestral player who now is no doubt playing in big orchestras and doing cool orchestral things. He had no interest in like, James Jamerson or Charlie Parker or learning how to record bands. And I think even in the last few years, it's only become apparent just sort of doubling down on the things that you're into. And it is hard when you're in a college because the college focus is, when you do a classical course, is playing in orchestras and playing classical music. And why wouldn't it be? That's what it's about. But embracing, and I still played electric, and I still, I was the sort of black sheep, but just embracing what you're interested in. Like for years, I was convinced that I was going to play in orchestras over in the evenings, but still do this and still do this and still do this. It's like, but do you want to do that? And sort of really recognizing, not because you've seen someone else do it, not because, you see someone like Lawrence Sunglass who can do anything, literally anything. And you think, oh, well, that's what I need to do because I double and he's really good, so I'm going to do what he does. It's like, well, do you want to do exactly what Lawrence is doing? Firstly, I don't think I'm really good enough to play like orchestral bass like Lawrence is, so it's just about finding your thing, maybe taking a sort of broader view of people, respecting Lawrence because Lawrence has said, no, I will be playing at Ronnie's and then I'm going to play in the LSO or whoever he plays with while doing a session at Abbey Road. That's what you should be focusing on, the fact that he's that person, and go, right, what are your things? You want to play in a band? Cool. You want to play jazz? Cool. You want to write music? Great. Whatever, I think sort of doubling down on what you are as a musician rather than trying to do all the cool stuff that everyone else is doing that looks good on Instagram. So I think that's what I'd say,
Thank you so much for being a part of it, man. I hope in some way this helps you out with your visa.
Thank you. It definitely will. And it's been nice to chat and do the thing and,
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, really good to catch up, Phil. It's been
John Gingell sends his love, by the way.
Oh, no way. When do you see John?
I'm working with him at the moment, so I'll see him this afternoon. But,
give him a cuddle for me.
I will do. Yeah.
All right, mate. Take care.
Nice one, mate. Thank you so much.
Bye.